I'm Harrison, and I'm here with another lecture. We're going to cover chapter 10 of the Lost Science of Money. It's been a while since I've done one of these lectures from this book, though, so before I do that, I'm going to do a quick review. You can check out all of this stuff on this channel, Greens for Monetary Reform, on YouTube. Hope you're subscribed already. And of course, the purpose of these lectures is to support H.R. 2990 of the 112th Congress, the National Emergency Employment Defense Act. This is going to create a Green New Deal and a people's bailout for all of us. So these lectures are a history of our monetary system and a history of the Federal Reserve banking system. So this is a people's genealogy of money. And so just to review, so the Lost Science of Money starts the origins of monetary systems, chapter 1, all the way back in 40th century BC, the agricultural revolution, and then flash forward to about 4000 BC. We start to see the beginning of lending based on agriculture, and with that comes writing, debt, and even consciousness. You know, this is the ancient Oriental systems, Egypt, Sumeria, etc. And the story moves to ancient Greece in 1500 to 1000 BC. And this is when we start to see the monetization of gold in Greece. And before this, money was alive. Money was lent. You know, money existed in the form of seeds or livestock, cows. One cow was worth about 140 talents of gold, or 3 to 4 slave women, I believe. And so it was customary to return some of the offspring of the livestock or some of the harvest of the grain as a bit of interest from that which was borrowed from one's neighbor. And this was the beginning of interest. And so in 1500 BC, we see money starting to be used the same way. People starting to charge interest on money itself, on gold. And we call this the usury era. And this is when we also see the beginnings of the East-West trade mechanism between silver and gold. The exchange ratios were different. This was ancient arbitrage. So the exchange ratios in the East were typically lower, say 6 silver to 1 gold, whereas in the West it was higher. You know, gold, 1 piece of gold to as much as 12 to 20 pieces of silver. So you could get better prices. You could take your gold west, get more silver for it. Take your silver east, get more gold for it. And whoever controlled this mechanism, this ancient central banking mechanism, usually controlled the world, had the most powerful civilization. And so this became Greece in 1500 BC, 2000 BC roughly, and things started getting rough in the 8th century BC. We started to see the breakdown of the Greek social order. Things in Sparta were really bad: money hoarding, land hoarding. So around 800 to 730 BC, Lycurgus started the reforms, and this is the Pelennor system. And so he called in all the gold, all the silver, and money was now in the form of these Pelennors, these iron bars that were heated, soaked in vinegar, so that they were worthless. And now no one would steal this money or hoard this money. And land was redistributed as well. Lycurgus had many other reforms. But things got really peaceful in Sparta for about 4 centuries. And this is what gave Spartans the leisure time they needed to train and provide for their national defense against Xerxes' hordes. You know, this is where 300 comes in, of course, the story of the 300 and King Xerxes, King Leonidas. And Spartans were also known for having the best food, and even their slaves were known for having better food than elsewhere in Greece, and they were known for their craftsmanship as well. So I mean, our Need Act is similar to this. We're fighting for this sort of sovereign public money that is based on this historical record. And so we see this a similar story starting again in the late 8th century BC with the reign of the second king of Rome, King Numa. Numa, he was a descendant of the Spartans, and he created a bronze nomisma system. So money in ancient Rome was controlled by the government essentially, and King Numa set up the position of the Pontificatus Maximus. This is the precursor to Jerome Powell's current position of chair of the Fed. But the Pontificus Maximus was responsible for coining gold. This was the prerogative, sacred prerogative that only the king, the Pontificus Maximus, had control over. Only the pontiff could coin gold. It's punishable for execution was the punishment for other kings who would try to coin gold. With King Numa and onward, the Pontificus Maximus was also known for organizing a calendar, for organizing seasons, stuff like that. King Numa was known for charming the warlike Romans into agriculture. And so the Republic rose with this sovereign public currency issued by the Pontificus Maximus. And this started to end in the 3rd century BC with the Second Punic War against Carthage. Hannibal was rampaging on the countryside with his elephants, using this nomisma to fund expeditions against Rome. And so Rome switched to silver and gold denariuses. This locked Rome into an endless cycle of warfare, which of course culminated in 40 BC with Caesar's pre-Civil War Rome. And Caesar, all the other, Brutus, Cassius, they were all coining their own gold coin. There was a lot of monetary chaos until eventually Augustus took over, of course. And the fall of the Roman Empire in 331 AD, chapter 3, we talked about the move of the Pontificus Maximus and the sacred gold prerogative from Rome to Byzantium. So Byzantium now has control over the sacred gold coining prerogative, as well as control over this east-west trading mechanism. And this lasted for quite some time. In chapter 4, we talk about the Dark Ages in Europe. And so we're talking like 742 to 814 AD. Zarlenga discusses Charlemagne as a false Renaissance. Charlemagne did not start the Renaissance, according to Zarlenga. He merely inflated Renaissance economy through war and slavery. And this is where we start to see the beginning of Jewish exploitation and Jewish involvement in the slave trade. And we also start to see the beginning of the Crusades in chapter 4 in 700, 800 AD. So, chapter 5, we move up to the 8th century. Venice, the trading fleet of Venice taps into this east-west trading mechanism, and they start redistributing wealth back into Europe. And this is actually the beginning of the Renaissance, not Charlemagne's false dawn. In 1095 AD, the Crusades were raging, and Zarlenga points out that this had nothing to do with religion or reclaiming the Holy Land, but control over this east-west trading mechanism. The Muslims turned out to be pretty hospitable. A lot of the Crusaders wound up staying. This is also the rise of the Knights Templar organization, which is really interesting. Zarlenga talks about how they were pretty much writing travelers' checks. They weren't protecting pilgrims. They were taking gold and silver from pilgrims and then issuing them checks that they would cash upon arriving at their destination, so they're not walking the roads with lots of money on them. And this is how they made a lot of money. The Knights Templar tapped into this east-west trading mechanism and They bought up most of the land in Europe until eventually they were expelled on Friday the 13th of, forgive me for not remembering the exact year, in 1500. So, 1204, the Venetian fleet sacks Constantinople during the Third Crusade. So this was actually a Christian on Christian battle, and the Venetian fleet brings a lot of metal back to Europe and redistributes it throughout Europe. And this is the beginning of the Renaissance. And so, chapter 6, we start talking about the creation of bank money, check money, the big Venetian bank houses, as well as the German banking houses, the fuggers. This is where we get the term "I got fucked," "I got fugged," came from these bankers who started making bank money just out of ledgers, basically fiat currency backed by nothing. So at this point, the private money prerogative of the Pontificus Maximus is eradicated. So Bruges becomes a major powerhouse, a major trading center known for pepper. Eventually, it declines, and moving on to 1536, the Protestant Reformation. In chapter 7, we talked about how John Calvin finished off the usury ban. The Catholics had a big ban on usury. They would not allow usurers, they would excommunicate usurers and not allow them to be buried in cemeteries. This was a huge deterrent. There's all sorts of ways around usury. But when John Calvin argued to legalize usury, now all of a sudden we see massive speculation in colonialism. And Zarlenga talks about the rape of the Americas, and Columbus's journey was essentially to take control over this east-west gold-silver trading mechanism. Chapter 8, we talk about the rise of Antwerp, major pepper trading center. Lots of Jews fled poverty from the Inquisition to Antwerp, and then eventually on to Amsterdam in the 1600s. And so chapter 9, we talk about the rise of capitalism in Amsterdam, again, due to public money, due to this public bank of Amsterdam, which issued the Agio, which was backed by gold and silver, and this public bank functioned very well for the city of Amsterdam. And the main reason why it failed is because it engaged in gold speculation with the Dutch East India Company, speculation in slavery, etc., and also due to the stock exchange of Amsterdam, which is the origin of modern-day derivatives trading, things like put and call options, futures tradings. And so after the stock exchange and war economy destroyed perfectly productive public economy in Amsterdam based on fishing, warehousing, and public money, we see the transfer of capitalism to England after these banking families pretty much suck all the wealth out of Amsterdam. And now in chapter 10 of Law, Science, Money, we get to the rise of capitalism in England. So this chapter is about the rise of capitalism in England, and just to review a few of the major themes of the Law, Science, and Money, is that the importance of this money power, again, the East-West trading mechanism, the gold prerogative, which is now, of course, the Federal Reserve. This history has purposely been censored by bankers. They don't want us to know this, so that's why these lectures are so important. How a society defines money determines who controls the money, and this battle has been going on for millennia. Here we are now. We need to understand the past in order to understand how to figure out how to bring peace to this conflict. The misuse of the monetary system causes tremendous misery and suffering for the ordinary working people, according to Will Decker and Martin Dunn, who took this first class with Sue Peters, who put together all these slides. Big debt of gratitude to her. And of course, the other major theme of this book is the importance of sovereign currency, which we have here in the National Emergency Employment Defense Act. This bill was written by Dennis Kucinich after he read this book. And this bill it epitomizes the best case studies we have of public money throughout history. And So the purpose of our inquiry is not merely to interpret monetary history, but indeed to transform it and to nationalize the Federal Reserve. We want to outlaw fractional reserve lending, and we want a nationalized Federal Reserve to spend money into existence directly on us, the 99%, updating our infrastructure, putting people to work, universal basic guaranteed income, public housing, public education, fully funded public elections, etc. So please check out greensformonetaryreform.org as always for more info. And as always, if you can donate, please donate to me. I put a lot of time studying this stuff, and rehearsing these lectures, and updating my production value here with this new open broadcast system. So if you can, please donate. In the long run, I'm hoping none of us will ever have to worry about money again, but until then, we better keep studying. So, jump back, maybe go watch The Tudors again real quick on Netflix, and let's jump back to the days of Henry VIII. So, England was a Catholic nation until Henry VIII broke with the Roman Church, of course. He was in love with Anne Boleyn, and he wanted the Pope to grant him a divorce. There was also a financial motive here. When Henry VIII broke with Rome, it was on persuasion of a man, Thomas Cromwell, a moneylender, and Oliver Cromwell's grandfather, wrote Belloc. On Cromwell's suggestion, he began the dissolution of monastery lands. Henry nullified papal appeals, and the key leader, Thomas More, a scholastic who argued against usury, was executed. From 1536 to 1553, the vast monastery lands were seized, first the small and then the large, creating a new class of millionaires. Henry VIII legalized usury in 1545, setting a limit of 10% per year. It remained to convert the general population. Apparently that didn't take too long. So before this, Zarlenga jumps back before the 1500s to talk about the English monetary background. England had two advantages over continental Europe. It was isolated, which kind of gave it a certain sovereignty. And when the Western Empire had degenerated, England's money system had totally collapsed back to barter, with no coinage circulating for 200 years from about 430 to 630 AD. As silver reappeared in Europe, coinage also revived in England. Many mints were established from 800 to 900 AD. Consistent with the sacred control of money, early Anglo-Saxon mints seem to have been run mainly under ecclesiastical dominion, wrote Craig, but there was some central control. All the dies for stamping coins had to come from London. So we see the same sort of beginning with capitalism in England. We see society based on with political control over the money system, and we're going to see the bankers gradually grab that control. At first, the king had control over the money, and we're going to see the same stories we saw in Greece, in Rome, and in Venice, in Antwerp, and Amsterdam. We're going to see bankers take control of the money from the government. So, laws of I'm going to slaughter this Alphastan's decree in 930 AD decreed that only one coinage should circulate in English. So now it's getting centralized. Minting thrived in the 10th century, and the abundance of silver is indicated by the large tribute payments Dangfeld. The Anglo-Saxon kings had as much control over the money of their realm as the emperor in Byzantium had over his. The main Anglo-Saxon coinage was the silver penny. Anglo-Saxon pennies were of token value rather than intrinsic value. So again, this fits with Aristotle's definition of money by law rather than money backed by some sort of commodity. The value fluctuated quite considerably in weight and finesse from one issue to the next. There's a monetary form of taxation. During this time, the Anglo-Saxon kings recoined the money about every 6 years, calling all the coins and issuing 3 pennies for every 4 taken in. This represented a 25% tax, or about 4% a year. So this prevents inflation and keeps things stable. After the Norman conquest in 1066 AD, the crown's coinage prerogative was strengthened. The re-coinage of 1279 to 81 indicates a circulation in England of 120 million pennies. The first English gold coinage was by Henry III in 1257. The coin didn't achieve widespread acceptance and was withdrawn and followed in 1343 by the noble. So, most discussions of English monetary history focus on the 17th century goldsmiths, bankers, and how they supposedly invented banking and paper money and were taken advantage of by an immoral monarch. This chapter examines that history from a very different perspective to gain a deeper understanding of the forces at work. With additional research and corroboration, this chapter, with chapter 11, should provide the structure for a full book-length work in itself, according to Zarlenga. So, the crown had a monetary prerogative. The key monetary feature of England as it emerged from medieval times was that the monetary power was concentrated in the king's hands, not divided among other nobles or bankers. As a result, England suffered less from monetary chaos than the nations emerging on the European continent. In the ongoing struggle between the king and the parliament, the fight over the monetary power was relatively mild. Under Edward III, 1326 to 1377, the Commons obtained three powers: parliamentary consent to all taxation. Both houses had to concur in all legislation, and the right to investigate and amend administrative abuses. You can see the beginnings of our division of powers in our government, the judicial and legislative. In 1346, the English Parliament attempted to gain control over money but was refused. 1414, Parliament tried to at least get a veto power on monetary matters, but was again refused. But despite modern-day prejudices, the English king's long-standing monetary prerogative had been used in a responsible manner for the benefit of the nation. There was only one instance of coinage debasement under Henry VIII, and this is the only one on record in English history. So, in May of 1600, we see a very important landmark case, the mixed money case. And we start to see a regaining of the lost science of money. The mixed money of Ireland case arose during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, known for her efforts to put the coinage on a sound footing. It's still cited in 20th century court decisions. Elizabeth issued base metal coinage as legal tender in Ireland in May 1600, annulling all other coins there and requiring they be returned to the mints. An Irishman then paid 100 debt to a London merchant and the new coinage. The merchant sued for the £100 in gold and silver coin. The case was argued at the highest levels and decided in favor of the Irishman. It formally restated many of the concepts of money lost in the dark and medieval ages from Aristotle. Key elements of the decision include the nature of money was identified as a societal institution rather than merely metal. Money is a public measure, and every commonwealth has adopted its own monetary system. The sovereign, or those licensed by him, has the authority to create the money of his dominions, and it is treason for any other to do so. When the sovereign declares a piece of money to be penny, groat, or shilling, that makes it so. The sovereign has the authority to increase or diminish, raise or lower monies, to enhance or depreciate their legal value, to decry them, and to reduce them to bullion, in which condition they may be prohibited to be used as money. This is a power that the state reserves for its own safety and welfare. Coins have intrinsic and extrinsic qualities. The intrinsic qualities consist of weight and finesse, the extrinsic of denomination and value. Intrinsic qualities are conferred by nature, the extrinsic by the sovereign or state. According to Alexander Dumas, the decision was so detested by the merchant classes, the goldsmiths, and later the British East India Company, that they worked incessantly to destroy it. And this occurred in two stages. First stage was to destroy the British Crown's monetary prerogative, throwing the control of money open to the merchants and financiers. This was done by undermining the Crown and then by passing the Free Coinage Act of 1666, but ultimately destroyed the monarchy, opening the way for a foreign element to establish a new monarchy and to reconstitute the money prerogative in the hands of a specific group of financiers, not elected, not representing society in a large part, not even English. Thomas Hobbes picked up on the religious undermining of the monarchy, which of course was a big part of the financial undermining of the monarchy. Thomas Hobbes, the renowned 17th century theorist, government power provides rare insight on the destruction of the monarchy in his major, though suppressed work, Behemoth, not Leviathan. And this happens in a Socratic dialogue style, so he's asking questions with regards to Charles. Charles was known as a pretty decent king. He was from descent continued above 600 years, and from a much longer descent of kings from Scotland. And he was a man that wanted no virtue, either of body or mind, nor endeavored anything more than to discharge his duty towards God in the well-governing of his subjects. The people were corrupted generally. But how came the people to be so corrupted? And what kind of people were they that did so seduce them? The seducers were divers of sorts. One sort was the ministers. Ministers of Christ, as they called themselves, sometimes gods and bastards, commonly called pedestrians. Others were papists, independents for religious freedom, Anabaptists, Fifth Monarchy men, Quakers, Adamites, and these were the enemies which arose against His Majesty from the private interpretation of Scripture, which had been exposed to every man's scanning in his mother tongue. For after the Bible was translated into English, every man, nay, every boy and wench that could read the English thought they spoke with God Almighty, and every man became a judge of religion and interpreter of the Scripture for himself. So this ability, this belief that anyone could speak directly with God had major consequences for undermining the sovereignty of the king. But you have not told me, asks Hobbes, by what art and by what degree the preachers became so strong. They had the concurrence of a great many gentlemen. These, by continual extolling of liberty and inveighing against tyranny, draw people to a dislike of the church, government, canons, and common prayer book. They did never in their sermons, or but lightly, inveigh against the lucrative vices of men's or trade or handicraft, such as are feigning, lying, cheating, fraud, deceit, hypocrisy, or other uncharitableness, except of want of charity to their pastors and to the faithful, which was a great ease to the generality of citizens and the inhabitants of market towns. So, much like in today with fundamentalist Christians in America, we see churches preaching against the sins of the poor, against the moral failures of the poor rather than moral failures of the rich. We see this misdirection away from usury, a cardinal sin in most other religions, but not of great importance in the Protestant tradition. They did, with great earnestness and severity, inveigh against carnal lusts and vain swearing, but the common people were thereby inclined to believe that nothing else was sin, but which is forbidden in the 3rd and the 7th commandments. For men are not ordinarily said to lust after another man's cattle or other goods or possessions, and therefore never made much scruple of the acts of fraud and malice. What have we then gotten by our deliverance from the Pope's tyranny? If these petty men succeed in the place of it, that have nothing in them that can be beneficial to the public except their silence, for their learning, It amounts to no more than an imperfect knowledge of Greek and Latin and an acquired readiness in the Scripture language, with a gesture and tone suitable thereunto, but of justice and charity, the manners of religion, they have neither knowledge nor practice, as is manifest in the stories I have already told you. Nor do they distinguish between godly and the ungodly, by conformity of design and men of judgment, or by repetitions of their sermons in the common sort of people. Reading Hobbes' Behemoth, the author is struck by similarities to present-day religious undermining of American democracy. So, back to the Jewish question. Again, we see not a Jewish conspiracy, but an unholy Protestant-Jewish alliance. The Protestants were typically the ones making the bank money, financing Jews who were runners. These were bagmen, people who had connections all over Europe due to the Jewish diaspora caused by the Inquisition. And so these were people who had connections all over the continent and could exchange money and goods. In England, the Jews had lived in England as moneylenders sanctioned by the English crown during the 12th and 13th centuries. The situation throughout Europe had grown ever more tenuous as centralized Roman power declined. By the 8th century, their legal status as Roman citizens under the Theodosian Code had ceased to give them any protection. Chapter 5 noted the dominant Jewish role in European slave trade from the 8th to 11th centuries, and the terrible vengeance extracted upon many Jewish communities by the Crusaders as they gathered for the first march to Jerusalem. Chapter 7's discussion of the Reformation outlined how Calvinism elevated the status of Jews for biblical reasons in the 1500s. From the 9th to 15th century, the status emerged as special exemptions to common law under the protection of princes. These conditions were often set forth in formal charters between the prince, king, and the organized Jewish community in his domain. Both sides expected to draw advantages from the arrangements. Again, this unholy Protestant-Jewish alliance. The Jews were often considered as property of the prince, and then sometimes in places, when they died, their property went to the prince. The charters licensed Jews to practice usury except against church property as collateral in order to minimize friction with the clergy. Kings and princes generally protected their Jews in order to protect the substantial revenues they got from them. And Pope Alexander IV added usury to the activities prosecuted by the Inquisition in 1257. James II of Aragon informed the Inquisition that his Jews were not to be tried for heresy. The story of Jewish usury is a continuous alternation of invitation, protection, protestation, and condemnation. Jewish money lending reached important proportions in England in the middle of the 12th century. In 1189 and 1190, there were massacres throughout the country. The rioters often sought out and destroyed the Jewish records of their indebtedness, wrote Parks. But this conflict between Jews and the regular population of England and other European cities was at the bottom of this failure, this conflict. Then and now is the error in the concept of money, viewing it as a commodity, failing to recognize the legal nature of money, and to act upon that knowledge and set up honest money systems based in law. Even today, one anticipated side effect of healthy monetary reform would be a meaningful reduction in the still continuing tension between Jewish and non-Jewish communities, and indeed between blacks, between whites, between men, between women, between parents, between children. This is why we say it's all the Fed's fault. The psychological consequences of our monetary systems cannot be underestimated. So on November 17th, 1279, many Jews throughout England were arrested. House-to-house search found large amounts of silver clippings. 680 Jews were imprisoned, out of whom 273 were hanged, along with 3 Christian goldsmiths. The problem persisted. In July 1290, Edward expelled all of the 16,511 Jews from England. So England eventually expelled the Cromwellian dictatorship as well as the Jews. Cromwell's corpse was exhumed from Westminster Abbey and hung from Tyburn Tree. Charles II was invited to return in 1660. Parliament intended to keep him on a short leash. And so, before the English Civil War, the king was thought to be allowed to possess sufficient capital and income to carry on the government. In abnormal times, he taxed the people, but after 1660, Parliament decided the king shouldn't have any capital of his own, and capital income should be voted on by Parliament. And so we see Parliament start to strangle Charles fiscally. The sanitized Whig histories of this period misrepresenting Charles II as a spendthrift and London's goldsmiths as good businessmen are still swallowed by economists. Christopher Hollis presents a very different picture in his book, The Two Nations. Charles needed a standing army to ward off continental threats, and Parliament refused to vote to give him the funds he needed. And Charles was actually forced to use his wife's dowry for expenses. Dutch financiers from Amsterdam appeared willing to finance him, but when he allowed legislation to pass that was counter to Dutch merchant desires, they concluded that the king could not be made serviceable to his creditors. Charles considered an issue to debase coinage to pay for the army, but merchants immediately raised their prices 10% in anticipation of a debasement. He offered to drop all talk of debasement if they would loan him £200,000, but they refused even that. The merchants were the most unfaithful, least devoted city merchants who refused to lend him money, showed no eagerness to pay taxes, and in approaching struggle were to the strongest allies of his enemies. 5 or 6 of these merchant goldsmiths were large enough to be considered bankers. They issued receipts for the deposits, which came to be used as currency between merchants and others. The London goldsmiths, who played a large part in the story of restoring England, were to a very great agent mere agents operating with Dutch money. So this is Dutch from Amsterdam, these Amsterdam banking houses moving into England. In 1667, Charles II began to issue a kind of paper money to pay state expenses. This was almost a true money and took the form of a royal exchequer orders to pay. Public fiat. This was good for coinage after 1 year by whoever held them. Taking one more step would have made them true money, that is, not having them payable in money, but just issuing it, had it succeeded, would have had far-ranging effects. Had it come to be recognized that when new money was required, it was the business of the king to issue it, Hollis noted, it would have changed world history. But Hollis contends that the goldsmith bankers blocked this new monetary experiment. Charles made the mistake of issuing his new money only in large denominations, so the recipient usually had to change it into smaller amounts. Banker goldsmiths offered to exchange the large notes for their own smaller notes, which promised to pay coinage on demand. Acting in concert, the goldsmith heavily discounted Charles' notes. So, Charles almost succeeded in creating sovereign currency. Didn't work. And the goldsmiths got together with the Dutch to conspire to create the Free Coinage Act of 1666, the Devil's Year. And so the mechanism of this act was deceptively simple. The act provided that anyone could bring gold or silver or bullion to the mint and have it refined and stamped into coins for free. So this takes away the king's power of seigniorage, of making money over producing money, and put this into the hands of the bankers rather than the crown. Thus, if the merchants were in debt, they could reduce the value of money, reduce the value of their debt by having more bullion turned into coin. If they were creditors and had extended loans, they could increase the value of what was owed to them by hoarding coinage or melting it into bullion and having it turned into coins again later, free of charge. Alexander Dalmar considered this a watershed event in monetary history. The Free Coinage Act specifically destroyed the royal prerogative of coinage, nullified the mixed money case, and inaugurated a future series of commercial panics and disaster, which to that time were unknown. The conception of money, which has grown up since the English Mint Act of 1666 and the French Mint Act of 1679, is that of two different things designed to measure one relation called value. Two things embraced in the confused conception of money, which thus acts are responsible for, are a commodity whose value conforms to an unknown cost of production, and a series of coins, notes, etc., value of which is an inverse ratio to their aggregate number, and which can therefore have no relation to the cost of production. So the Free Coinage Act confuses the nominal value of money with its commodity value. The appropriation of the goldsmith classes of the royal prerogative has been accomplished in so stealthy a manner that scarcely a trace of it appears in historical works, and none at all in works devoted to political economy. A glaring proof, if any, were needed of the prejudices and one-sidedness which have hitherto animated the teachers of that science. Of all the elements of political economy, money is the chiefest. Of all the institutions of money, the right to create it is the most important. Yet not a word concerning this once sacred right by the state is to be found in any of the economists. So the result of the Free Coinage Act of 1666 was that the goldsmiths and the banking classes gained control over commerce. And of course, this gave the British East India Company, the largest company on England's stock exchange in the 1600s and 1700s, major control over commerce. And of course, the British East India Company, heavily financed by the Dutch, owned by the Dutch, traded on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. In the early 1600s, business was going badly for the British East India Company. Then in 1677, the French army besieged their main competitor, Amsterdam, and the Dutch East India Company's shares of the British East India Company quickly rose. The British East Company was competing with the Dutch East India Company, and it was going badly for the Brits in 1700, but it started to rise again after the French army took out the Dutch in 1677. The British East India Company was run very badly. In 1681, numerous complaints were made to the king that very few people got benefit of this company. There were 550 shareholders, but most of the company was held by 40 people. Shares seldom came to market and tended more and more to get in the hands of a few individuals. In 1681, there were no regular dealings in East India Company shares, though there was a general lively desire to buy them. A substantial portion of the shares of the British company were owned by foreigners. The British East India Company was sending British silver to India and bringing back gold. John Locke complained about it in 1718. And the British East India Company promoted the Free Coinage Act of 1666 because they wanted to monetize their imported gold bullion directly into coinage rather than sell it on the market, which would have very different results. So, after the Free Coinage Act of 1666, this leaves the English crown vulnerable, and William III, his wife Mary, was the Protestant daughter, Catholic James II of England. And William was invited by elements in England to mount a campaign to temporarily take the monarchy. And after 30 years of planning the assault, misnamed the Glorious Revolution, landed in November 1688. This invitation to William was sent in a letter sent by notable Englishmen and received by him on June 30th, 1688. And they talk about the need for surprise and stealth and quickness here. And William's attack had heavy Jewish financing. Isaac Lopez Suassuna of The Hague advanced him 2 million gold crowns, interest-free. Suassuna was later made the Baron of Hermes de la Grasse. So again, we see the same Protestant-Jewish unholy alliance between William of Orange and Isaac Lopez Suassuna. From the reign of William III of Orange, we see the precise origins of the primary destructive mechanisms operating upon society at the present time. The Prince of, from Sir Archibald Alison's History of Europe, the Prince of Orange bought from the Republic of Holland, where it had already been practiced, the thoroughly understood secret of governing popular assemblies and extracting heavy taxes from popular communities. His whole effort was directed to gain the majority of the constituencies by corruption and votes of parliament by patronage. It was then that the national debt began, and government was taught the dangerous secret of providing for the necessities and maintaining the influence of present times by borrowing money and laying its payment on prosperity. Taine wrote, William III's reign had been one long series of wars and commercial crises which had so disturbed the country. There is a deadness of want and of spirit in the nation universally. There is nothing to be seen but corruption in high places and brutality among the common people, a group of intriguers leading a populace of brutes. William himself arrived by Dutch guilders. A few years later, Britain found herself with a founded national debt on the Dutch model and a Bank of England set up with capital assistance from Amsterdam. All this did not go unopposed. The bank was a Whig bank supplying a Whig government with money for a Whig war. Small wonder that the Tory country gentlemen, looking on in helpless frustration, bitterly dubbed this system Dutch finance. So in an anticlimax, the Jews were allowed back into England by royal decree. The first Jewish settlers, according to Roth, brought back 1.5 million pounds of gold with them. Jewish Encyclopedia remarks, the reign of William III marked a period of exceptional prosperity for the Jews. The prince employed Jews in his negotiations with foreign kings, and Isaac Lopez Suassuna, who lent 2 million guilders to William for his descent upon England. While the large Jewish moneylenders had the king in debt, the benefits don't seem to have trickled down to the average Jew. By the middle of the 1700s, the number of Portuguese Jewish stockbrokers working in London for correspondents in Holland was considered the only the two most prominent, Gideon and Salvador, were on the government's approved list for government underwriters. In spite of the emphasis laid by the 18th century writers in England and Holland on the part played by Jews in finance, it is clear that individually the Christian firms, the Van Necks, Staples, the Barings, the Van Nottens, the Molmans, the Bosquians, the Dorians were bigger and more important. It is they who moved from trade and commodities into legitimate banking. On the whole, the Dutch Portuguese Jews who came to England did not find a permanent place in British finance. From this point, it becomes more difficult to separate the financial activities of the major Jewish, Dutch, and English financiers, who all used very similar financial methods. Those responsible for the treasury of war, finance, privately owned and controlled central banking, creating impossible government debts, with correspondingly harsh taxation, are not always identified with any one national, religious, or racial body, international cartels. They are more appropriately identified as a financial group or gang, not really large enough to be called a class. So Hollis sums up this transfer of capitalism to England from Amsterdam. He says, at the turn of the century, London established itself as all that Amsterdam was, or to put the truth more exact accuracy, an international gang, which had up till then operated from Amsterdam, found it more convenient to operate from London instead. So that's chapter 10, the law, science, and money. Next chapter, we're going to talk about hatching the Bank of England, chapter 11, and eventually that'll lead us to the Federal Reserve. So, again, please help support my work. If you get value out of this, this is very important censored history. I put a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of research and rehearsal into getting this history out into the open so that we can have an actual monetary revolution, so that we don't have to ever worry about money again. And of course, this is all to support HR 2990 of the 112th Congress, the National Emergency Employment Defense Act. And this is going to give us the monetary system that we've been waiting a millennia for. So please keep studying, and I'll see you for chapter 11 soon. Please like, please share, please comment, please ask questions on this video.